Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I wanted to do something a little bit different than what I normally do. Today I wanted to talk about the MVP race, but not the MVP race as a whole. I wanted to talk about one particular individual in the MVP race, and that, as you can tell from the video that you clicked on, is Carpe. The reason why I want to talk about Carpe today is because I think that Carpe is the most interesting MVP candidate in the race. But the reason for that isn't because he's a sleeper pick for MVP, but more so that the narrative that has surrounded Carpe originally was, Carpe is the clear MVP frontrunner, to the point now where we have people like Sideshow saying, if you vote Carpe for MVP, you're the most basic berry in the entire world. So it's a very interesting dynamic and a very interesting thing to look at, that Carpe was at one point in time the MVP frontrunner, and now it seems like it's very up in the air. And why is that? Is that more so because Carpe has slipped? Is it because other people have gone up? I just kind of want to talk about it a little bit and give my thoughts on what's happened. The goal for this video is not for this to be a campaign for or against Carpe as MVP. I'm not here to tell you that Carpe should be or shouldn't be MVP through this video. What I'm trying to look at in this video is to break down Carpe's candidacy, break down what is going in Carpe's favor and what is going against Carpe by looking at stats, talking about some of the eye test things, and some other factors that I think have either boosted his chances or have hurt his chances significantly to be MVP. So, with that all out of the way, let's start with stats, because stats are very important, and stats are a huge part of what determines whether or not a player is or isn't really an MVP caliber player. So to start, let's take a look at the rate ranks from the Overwatch League Stats Lab. I'll be throwing up some stats as I talk about them on the screen, but let's take a look at some of the important stats here, which are the stats per 10 minutes that show up in the stats per 10 list. There's a couple of stats here that are important that I want to talk about, so I'm going to mention the stats we're going to look at, and then we will jump in and take a look at them. So, we have final blows per 10 minutes, eliminations per 10 minutes, hero damage per 10 minutes, deaths per 10 minutes, and solo kills per 10 minutes. Those are the stats that are the most important, I would say, in regards to damage players. And for this argument for whether or not Carpe should be considered MVP, this is by far the most important aspect to look at. And when it comes to looking at the per 10 stats, what's important to note about that is that you're saying, okay, if you were to take a player and you were to kind of boil them down to their average performance on a game-to-game basis, how good is this player? Per 10 is difficult to look at because it's very skewed depending on how much a player plays. If a player has one series where they play, or they play one map, and they are incredible, their eliminations per 10 is going to go up. If they play a lot and are good, they might not be as high, even though they are better on average because they're playing a lot more and whatnot. So it is a little difficult to say for sure. It skews in the favor of strong performances if you only play a couple times, which is what's super important to look at. So let's start with final blows per 10 minutes. This is a very important stat, and one that is very good, especially for damage dealers. So it doesn't give you the full picture of whether or not, it's a big thing to say, and whether or not, if you're leading final blows for 10 minutes, it doesn't necessarily mean you're an MVP candidate, because if you're a main tank, you're making space, or if you're a support, you're healing your team. You shouldn't be leading in final blows. But if we look at the final blows for 10 minutes, of all of the MVP candidates, Carpe has the highest final blows per 10 minutes of any of them in the league. Carpe has, on average, 9 final blows per 10 minutes. The next closest is Exy at 8.7, and then Yaki and Fleta at 8.5. So, in that regard, of all the damage players, Carpe is averaging the most final blows of any of them. When it comes to eliminations per 10 minutes, Carpe is second among the MVP candidates. The damage dealing MVP candidates should specify, behind Fleta, and tied with Yaki. Also ahead of him, however, is Choi Hyobin at 19.8. Carpe is averaging 18.9 eliminations per 10 minutes. Hero damage, another interesting one. Carpe is averaging 8,103.8 per 10 minutes. That is the highest of all of the MVP candidates, period. And it's actually a pretty big jump. If I recall correctly, he's 13th on this list. The next highest is Exy, who's 30th on this list. So Carpe is outputting a lot of damage, and that's something that's very impressive for a DPS player, because tanks typically do a lot of damage if they are kind of a main tank or an off tank. They can get a lot of damage in. Now, they don't normally have as much damage as your damage dealers, but the fact that there's none really in the top 30 is interesting. I believe the highest is QOQ of any tank on this list, so it is interesting to look at there. As we move on to deaths per 10, this is a really interesting stat to look at, because obviously with deaths per 10, you want to be closer to the bottom, and deaths per 10 is a stat that encompasses every role, really. A support player doesn't want to die, a damage player doesn't want to die, nor do tanks want to die. And when you look at this one, is another interesting one for Carpe. He is, among all of the MVP candidates, he is third, averaging 3.9 deaths per 10. That is tied with Krong, and then is below Void, who has the second best deaths per 10 rate in the league, behind only Swimmer, who hasn't played since like April. Very good from Void there, but Carpe, not bad either, doing very well in the deaths per 10. He's not dying a lot, he's staying alive a lot, which is a big part of what has helped some of his other stats, which we'll get to here in a little bit. Finally, when it comes to solo kills, Carpe is second in the MVP group. Exy is second overall with 1.8. Carpe falls in at 1.1, around SBB and Glister, Nene, BQB, Decay, and Striker. The next below him of the MVPs would be Yaki. So, in general, Carpe is averaging very, very, very well among the per 10 ranks. Among all of the MVP candidates, he does, if not better than all of them, similar to all of them, and he's closer in a lot of those stats with some of those other players that are also nominated. As we move on to the season totals, we see some other interesting stats, where also, once again, you have to note with season totals, it of course skews towards players who have played more matches. Carpe has played many hours. He has played a lot more than a number of players have, and so his numbers are going to be somewhat different from other players. But there are some very interesting ones to look at here, and it is the big things that work in his favor more than anything else. So we're going to start with final blows. Carpe leads the entire league in final blows with 1,024. It is where he is the most dominant. If you want to look at his kind of seasonal performance, this is really the list where you look at and you say Carpe has had a really good year getting kills and doing damage and doing very, very well in that regard. Leading the league in final blows. When it comes to eliminations, he is, I believe, 6th in the league. 3rd among MVP candidates, fourth among MVP candidates behind Void, Fleta, and Krong. He's only 9 behind Krong. Krong, in terms of playtime, has more playtime, as does Sato, who's ahead of him, and Fleta, who's ahead of him, and Void, and Hanbin. They're all ahead of Carpe. So it's not weird to look at that and say, okay, Carpe's behind some of these players, but he also hasn't played as much as them. Interesting to note, it's part of why looking at this stat isn't the most telling. He's very close to Alarm in the elims rate, and he actually has less playtime than Alarm does. But once again, Alarm is a support player, so he's not really going for elims as much as, say, Carpe is. In hero damage, Carpe is 5th, behind Void, is the only MVP candidate that's ahead of him. And when it comes to solo kills, Carpe is 3rd, behind KSP and Happy. So stats-wise there, you look at kind of the season totals, Carpe's stats are pretty good. But the interesting one, and kind of the big season stat that has really kind of had Carpe stocks on the rise, is his final blow to death ratio, which is 2.3. As I mentioned earlier, he doesn't die very often. He's only dying on average about 4 times per 10 minutes, which is pretty good. It's one of the best in the league. And when he's averaging final blows wise, significantly more than that as well. You know, he's on 1,024 all year, and on the season kind of final blows average in general per 10 minutes is 9.0. So he's averaging a very good ratio there because he has final blows, he's doing well, deaths, he's doing very well as well. So those things work together. And that's something that you don't see as much with other DPS players. Fleta has a good final blow to death ratio as well. His is 2.0, but Carpe's is 2.3, and it seemingly will not be touched. Striker, who has played 7 fewer hours, was one of the players who I thought could compete with him, and his final blow to death ratio has gone down recently. So it really is impressive what Carpe has managed to do final blow to death ratio wise. It's very impressive to see that he is having incredible hard carry performances, and he's not dying a lot. And a lot of that plays into the clutch factor of Carpe, which has been by far the most recent thing that people have looked at and talked about that has been a huge part of Carpe's MVP candidacy, if you will. So I'm going to pull up this graph. You'll see here this chart, this table, if you will, I guess is the word to use. This table is the clutch final blows table. Essentially, all it means is the rate at which teams win overtime team fights compared to how players perform in those team fights when they are not advantaged. So if it's either equal number of players or they're down players, how are players performing? And if you look at this table, which can be a little bit messy, I know, you'll see Carpe. I have a nice little circle there for you. You can see him pretty clearly. He's not too difficult to make out. That is where Carpe is sitting right now. And obviously, the first thing you note is he is not the player averaging the most final blows per 10 minutes, which is, of course, your horizontal x-axis here. Once is averaging 10.4 final blows per 10 minutes. Shaq is averaging 11.07. Architect is averaging 10.443. Jerry's averaging 10.349. All of that compared to Carpe's 10.284. Neither is Carpe the player who has the highest win rate in these team fights. Super is higher. Fleta, Lip, Fearless, Void, Izzyaki are all higher. Even members on Carpe's own team are higher. People like Funny Astro and Ivy. All of them have higher win rates than Carpe does. But what's important to note about Carpe is that he is by far the leading member of his team, especially when it comes to how many final blows he gets in these clutch moments. As I mentioned before, averaging 10.284. The second highest on his team is Poco at 6.396. He is averaging roughly 4 more final blows per 10 minutes than anybody else on his team, which is very impressive, and it is one of the leading things for his MVP candidacy, and that is by far one of the most important things to look at if you want to discuss Carpe being an MVP. He doesn't die a lot, and he gets a lot of kills. He has a very high final blow to death ratio, and he comes up big in clutch moments. Those are the two things that are really important to note for Carpe. He's doing really well in the stats, and those can tell you a lot, but nothing is more important in those stats than if you Just take a look at what he is doing. He's getting kills and not dying a lot, and he's winning team fights and coming up big in team fights when his team needs him. So, when you think of those things, seems very, very, very good to look at for MVP race. Seems like something that you could definitely make an argument for, make a case for, but there, of course, are other things to factor in as well. Some non-statistical things, stuff like an eye test. Does Carpe really pass an eye test of being a super dominant damage player? At times, yes. At times, no. There's certain moments where Carpe really comes in, has a huge moment. You know, when he said sit to Baby Bay during a match with the Atlanta Reign. Yeah, that's a huge moment, and a moment that you look at and go like, wow, that's really like Carpe asserting his dominance. It's a huge moment. He came up really big in their match against the LA Gladiators on Lijiang Tower. Those are some moments that really stick out to me as kind of big Carpe moments, where Carpe kind of showed how good he was, and moments where Carpe was really just kind of showing up and just asserting his dominance against opponents. But a big problem that Carpe has, and something you have to acknowledge when you think about Carpe's MVP candidacy and whether or not he deserves it, is that a lot of the conversation surrounding Carpe as MVP came very importantly at the beginning of the season, within the first 5 weeks, when we weren't seeing teams like Shanghai or Guangzhou play, and when most of the Pacific teams that had played in week 1, if not all of the Pacific teams that had played in week 1, were not playing either. You know, San Francisco had only played 1 game at that time. Vancouver, before they fell apart, had played 1 game or 2 games at the time. So there weren't a lot of matches being played by these teams who we now look at as really good, dominant teams. Shanghai hadn't played. San Francisco had only played 1 game. Guangzhou hadn't played. Paris hadn't gotten to their best dominant self, though, of course, they did have their win against the Philly Fusion. They were the first team to beat them back in March, right before COVID hit and everything was moved online. But since the move to online play, the Philadelphia Fusion and Carpe have not been the blockbusters that they were at the beginning of the season. The competition has gotten better. Better teams have kind of stepped up and taken the center of attention. And a lot of that has led to a downfall for Carpe's MVP stocks. And in addition to that, not only have other teams started to look better and other damage players have started to really show up, like Yaki, like Fleta, like Exy, though he, of course, had a little bit of issues at an earlier point in the season where he couldn't really play. You know, there are a number of other players who have been very clearly instrumental to their team's success this season, to a revitalization of a team. Carpe isn't that player. Carpe has been a central part of this Fusion roster since 2018. He has been the most important piece, arguably, of this Fusion roster since 2018. And at the moment, that has not changed. And while Carpe has had a really great season, you also have to look at the backline of the Philadelphia Fusion, where you have Alarm, who's having an incredible season as well, who has really enabled Sato to perform very well. And you have players like Fury who are performing very well. And you have players like Funny Astro who are performing very well. And you have a whole number of pieces around Carpe that are performing at such a high level that you look at Carpe and you say, how much work is Carpe really doing at this point in time? When he's not really carrying fights anymore. He's not really carrying the Fusion in a way that players like Yaki are. Or Fleta sometimes is coming in and having these huge clutch moments and winning fights in really big matches, which is where Carpe hasn't shown up. The Fusion haven't played in many big matches, and when they have, Carpe hasn't really been a huge piece in those big matches. He didn't play in the Countdown Cup finals. In the Summer Showdown finals, EQO was really the centerpiece of the team. So when you really look at Carpe, especially recently, since they've moved to online play, and especially when the Fusion have kind of had this recent resurgence back towards the top in North America, 2 back-to-back tournament finals appearances, and both of them they lost. It's clear that Carpe's performances have been somewhat weaker and have been less prominent and strong when you look at a lot of what has happened. It doesn't necessarily mean that he's no longer an MVP, but it's clear that this Fusion team have not been able to come up big, and that has hurt Carpe's potential to be an MVP candidate. That doesn't necessarily mean that there is reason to believe that he can't be an MVP candidate, obviously. And just because the team isn't giving Carpe the opportunities that they have been giving him in the past doesn't mean that he can't be MVP, because, just because he's being subbed out doesn't mean anything. Sinatra didn't play like at all in Stage 4 last season, and he won the MVP award. This is a look at Carpe as a whole. Is it justified for Sideshow to say, if you vote for Carpe, it's a basic Barry choice, right? Is Carpe really somebody that we should still be arguing as an MVP candidate? Do the stats alone make up for the fact that Carpe recently hasn't had those big game performances? He hasn't had those huge team wins, and his team around him is so good and so strong that has Carpe's kind of decline in terms of flashiness. Does that really impact his MVP race? And does that mean that we should look elsewhere? And should we even continue to put a ton of stock into Carpe as an MVP? I still think there's a lot of reason to think Carpe is a good MVP candidate. I don't know if I'm ready for sure to say that he is or is not MVP, but I think it's a very interesting race to look at. I think Carpe's fall has been one of the most interesting things to look at, the narrative surrounding it. I still think he's a front runner. I still think there's a really good chance that he is our MVP, but is he truly the MVP? Only time will tell. But I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know. But I am going to get out of here. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.